The night shift at the Magdalena Ridge Observatory was never supposed to be exciting. Dr. Lena Vasquez had been staring at frequency readouts for 6 hours straight, surviving on cold coffee and the quiet hum of cooling servers. Outside, the New Mexico desert was silent under a sky so thick with stars it looked painted. She had chosen this job because she loved the silence, because she believed in the deeply personal way that astronomers do that the universe was full of answers, and that patience was the only currency that bought them. At 2:47 a.m., the universe answered back. It started as noise, a repeating blip buried beneath solar wind interference and cosmic background radiation. Lena almost flagged it for deletion. Her finger hovered over the keyboard. Something stopped her, maybe instinct, maybe exhaustion making her slow. She pulled the frequency apart manually, layer by layer, and felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. It was structured, not the chaotic randomness of pulsar emissions or the rhythmic pulse of a rotating neutron star. This was organized. There were patterns within patterns, a mathematical skeleton beneath what looked like static. Lena sat up straight for the first time in hours. She ran the signal through 3 different filters. Then she called Dr. Marcus Webb, her supervisor, even though it was nearly 3 a.m. He answered on the second ring, groggy and irritable. He was not irritable for long. By dawn, the signal had been confirmed by 6 independent observatories across 4 continents. By noon, a team of cryptolinguists at MIT had identified a repeating structural element consistent with distress encoding. The same mathematical logic humans had theorized any intelligent species would use to signal emergency, because mathematics is the only truly universal language. By evening, a rough translation had been assembled from the repeating numerical sequences, cross-referenced against every contact protocol ever theorized by SETI researchers over 70 years of hopeful waiting. The message was devastatingly simple. Coordinates, a biological identifier, a DNA analog sequence later understood to represent a species tag, and a single repeating symbol that, when run through every translation matrix the team had, kept returning the same meaning across every interpretive framework they tried. Dying. Not danger, not help, not even SOS in the abstract sense, the specific, unambiguous, biologically rooted concept of a living thing ending. Whoever sent this message had not been subtle. They had not been diplomatic. They had stripped their cry down to its barest truth because they did not have time for anything else. Lena sat alone in the observation room long after the building had filled with government officials, military personnel, and intelligence analysts she had never seen before. Someone had hung a blackout curtain over the main window. Men in dark suits were photographing her equipment. She didn't mind. She was still staring at the original readout on her personal screen, the one no one had thought to confiscate yet. She thought about what it meant, not geopolitically, not strategically, just personally. Someone had looked out into the dark across an incomprehensible distance with what might have been the last functional transmitter on their world and aimed their voice at the one direction where they hoped someone might be listening. They had aimed it at Earth. Lena had spent her entire career believing that moment would feel triumphant. She had imagined champagne, tears of joy, headlines that changed history. Instead, she felt something quieter and more serious settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. Because the message wasn't hello. It wasn't an introduction or an invitation or the beginning of a beautiful new chapter in human civilization. It was a scream. And the only question that mattered now, the question that was already being argued in rooms she would never be allowed to enter, by people with far more power and far less wonder than she had, was whether anyone was going to scream back. She already knew her answer. She suspected, in the marrow-deep way that humans know the things they know before they know them, that most of humanity already knew its answer too. The only question was how fast they could move. Outside, the New Mexico desert was warming into morning. A hawk circled lazily over the ridge. The sky was turning from black to deep purple to the particular shade of blue that always made Lena think the world was starting over. She finished her cold coffee. She looked at the coordinates one more time, 340 light-years, a journey no human had ever made toward a species whose name she couldn't yet pronounce. She thought someone went out there and got hurt. She thought we're going to go get them. She didn't know yet how right she was. The United Earth Emergency Council had been designed for crises. It had been convened 17 times in its 30-year history. for pandemics, for climate disasters, for the three regional conflicts that had nearly gone nuclear in the 2040s. Its members were experienced, pragmatic, and deeply practiced in the art of moving slowly while appearing to move quickly. They were not, by nature or training, people who made large decisions fast. They made this one in 6 hours. The session opened at 9 a.m. Geneva time in a room that had no windows, because the architects who designed it understood that people negotiating the fate of civilization should not be distracted by weather. 41 representatives sat around a curved table. The signal data was displayed on a central screen. Every person in the room had read the briefing documents on the flight over. The room smelled of coffee and anxiety. Ambassador Chen Wei of the Pacific Alliance spoke first. She was 73 years old and had spent her career in rooms exactly like this one. She did not waste time. We have received a confirmed distress transmission from an extraterrestrial intelligence located 340 light-years from Earth, she said. The species has been designated the Velhari. They are under attack by an unknown aggressor. The question before this council is whether and how humanity responds. What followed was not a debate so much as a collision. General Amara Diallo of the African Union Defense Command wanted to know about military assets, specifically whether Earth's 3 operational FDL-capable vessels, built in the decade following the Alcubierre Drive breakthrough of 2041, could be retrofitted for combat operations on a timeline that mattered. Her logistics chief confirmed they could. She made a note. The European Federation's representative, a cautious economist named Dr. Pieter Horn, raised the question of resource expenditure. A military operation at 340 light-years would cost more than any single program in human history. He had a spreadsheet. Several people told him, politely and then less politely, that this was not the moment for the spreadsheet. The North American Compact's security advisor raised the threat assessment question. What did humanity actually know about the aggressor? The answer was almost nothing. The Velhari transmission had identified the attacking force by a phonetic tag that translated roughly as Kreth, a word that appeared in the signal's distress encoding with a frequency suggesting it was a name the Velhari associated with existential fear. That was all. No ship counts, no weapon assessments, no tactical intelligence. We would be sending forces into an unknown conflict against an unknown enemy in support of a species we have never met, the security advisor said, based on a single transmission we decoded 12 hours ago. Yes, said General Diallo, that is correct. And you're comfortable with that? Diallo looked at him with the expression of someone who had been comfortable in uncomfortable situations her entire professional life. I'm not comfortable with ignoring it, she said. The debate went in circles for 4 hours. Protocols were cited. Precedents were argued. Someone raised the philosophical question of whether humanity had any obligation to species it had no prior relationship with. Someone else pointed out that the entire concept of humanitarian aid was built on exactly that principle, that suffering creates obligation regardless of prior relationship. It was Colonel James Harker of the North American Compact who ended it. He was not the most senior person in the room. He was not scheduled to speak. He stood up without being recognized, and something in his posture made the room go quiet before he opened his mouth. He was 51 years old. He had spent 22 years in deep-sea rescue operations before transferring to the Space Defense Command. He had pulled people out of situations that should have been unsurvivable, more times than he could count, and he had a scar along his left jaw from the last time he'd done it. I've listened to 4 hours of this, he said, and I want to ask one question. He looked around the room slowly. If it was us sending that signal, if it was Earth burning, and we had managed to aim one last transmission into the dark, what would we want the answer to be? The room was quiet. We go, he said. We figure out the rest on the way. The vote was called 20 minutes later. 38 in favor. 2 abstentions. 1 opposed, Dr. Horn, who voted no and then immediately requested a seat on the Mission Planning Committee because he was, whatever else, a practical man. In 6 hours, humanity had made the decision that would change the galaxy. The shipyards began running triple shifts before midnight. The thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy had never understood, had never wanted to understand closely enough to find out, was that they were not brave because they were unafraid. They were brave because they were afraid of the right things. Commander Yara Osai learned about the galactic database classification on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into mission preparation, when an encrypted data package arrived at Earth Defense Command with no identifiable origin. The package contained 847 files in 11 different alien languages, several of which human linguists had never seen before. It took 4 days to crack enough of it to understand what they were reading. The files were Kreth intelligence assessments. Someone had stolen them from somewhere dangerous and sent them to Earth anonymously, apparently hoping humanity would know what to do with the information. Most of the files detailed Kreth military operations, fleet movements, conquest timelines, resource extraction records from species they had subjugated. Grim reading. The kind of files that made mission planning teams go very quiet. But it was File 7 that stopped everyone cold. File 7 was a galactic survey document, a standardized catalog used by spacefaring civilizations to classify inhabited worlds. Every planet in the database was assigned a habitability rating based on atmospheric composition, gravity, temperature variance, biological threat density, and a dozen other factors. The scale ran from Class 1 to Class 10. Class 1 worlds were paradise, stable, gentle, calm. The Velhari homeworld was a Class 2. The Kreth homeworld was a Class 4. Most sapient species, the document noted, had evolved on worlds between Class 1 and Class 5, because worlds more hostile than that tended to kill complex life before it could develop intelligence. Earth was listed as Class 9. The notation beneath the classification was brief, clinical, and devastating in its implications. It read in translation, extreme biological hostility, persistent large predator populations, atmospheric oxygen content at cellular damaging concentrations, gravity 40% above galactic mean for inhabited worlds, surface temperature variance lethal without technological mediation, microbial threat density extraordinary, indigenous sapient species confirmed. Contact status, AVOIDED, recommendation, do not approach. Someone had written, in what appeared to be a personal annotation added to the file much later, a single line in Kreth script. The mammals of the Deathworld have achieved spaceflight. Monitor but do not engage. Yara read this 3 times. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound that made her aide look up from across the room with concern. "They've been watching us," she said. "The whole time. Every civilization out there watching us, and nobody said hello because they were afraid of our planet." She thought about what Earth looked like from outside. She tried to see it the way a species from a Class 2 world would see it. A world where the apex predators were large enough to kill with a single blow. Where the ocean was full of animals specifically evolved to be lethal. Where the weather could flatten cities. Where the very air was corrosive enough to rust metal. Where humans had spent 10,000 years finding increasingly efficient ways to kill things, starting with other animals, and eventually applying the same innovative energy to killing each other. And then they had looked up at the stars. A species like that achieving spaceflight, she realized, must have looked to the rest of the galaxy like a nightmare scenario. No wonder no one had made contact. They had collectively decided that the best approach to the Deathworld was to be extremely quiet and hope the loud ones didn't notice them. The mission preparation took on a different energy after File 7. Not arrogance, Yara would not permit arrogance, and she had the kind of command presence that made her opinions on the matter extremely clear, but something like awareness. The crew's training for the Velhari operation began to understand something about themselves that they had never had context to understand before. They were the product of a world that had spent 4 billion years stress-testing life and keeping only what survived. Their cardiovascular systems had been forged by chasing prey across open savanna. Their pain tolerance had been shaped by a planet that did not forgive weakness. Their capacity for cooperation under pressure, the thing that had really let humans outlast every other apex predator on Earth, was the result of surviving threats so large that no individual could face them alone. They were, by galactic standards, monsters. Monsters who had decided to go rescue someone. The 3 FTL vessels, Resolute, Unyielding, and Perseverance, were refitted with weapons systems that Earth's engineers had been developing theoretically for decades. The crews were selected not just for military skill, but for psychological resilience, the ability to function in novel, high-pressure, information-sparse environments. Medics were trained in xenobiology basics, working from the biological data embedded in the Velhari transmission. Translators ran the signal through AI modeling systems around the clock, building a working Velhari language framework from a distress call. 43 days after the signal arrived at Magdalena Ridge Observatory, 3 ships crossed the boundary of the solar system and entered FTL. Yara stood at the bridge of the Resolute and watched the stars stretch into light. She thought about the annotation in File 7, "Do not approach." She thought you should have said hello when you had the chance. The Velhari system looked like a bruise from 2 light towers out. The long-range sensors painted a picture that the Resolute's tactical officer, Lieutenant Dara Kim, described in her mission log as a systematic demolition. 3 of the system's 4 inhabited bodies were showing thermal signatures consistent with large-scale surface bombardment. Debris fields ringed the second planet, what the Velhari transmission had identified as their primary agricultural world, in a glittering belt of what had once been orbital infrastructure. The gas giant's moon, which preliminary data suggested had housed a population of approximately 200,000, was no longer emitting any electromagnetic signals at all. The Kreth fleet was still there. 11 warships, each one massing between 2 and 4 times the tonnage of the Resolute. They were positioned in a standard post-conquest formation, 4 vessels in high orbit over the primary planet, the rest spread across the inner system in a pattern that said, clearly and without ambiguity, "This is ours now." They had not detected the human ships yet. FTL emergence signatures could be masked with enough lead time, and Earth's engineers had been thorough. Yara had 40 minutes before the Kreth sensors would likely identify them. She used 30 of those minutes to think. Her tactical team presented 3 options: a direct engagement approach, using the element of surprise to hit the high-orbit vessels before the rest of the fleet could consolidate; a communications-first approach, announce presence, attempt negotiation, engage if negotiations failed; a hybrid, announce presence while simultaneously taking up an aggressive tactical position, making the power dynamics clear from the first word. Yara chose the third option, not because she thought it would work, but because she believed, in a way that she couldn't entirely justify tactically and didn't try to, that the Velhari survivors, whoever and wherever they were, deserved to know that someone had shown up talking before they started shooting. The Resolute moved into hailing range. The other 2 ships fanned out to flanking positions without being told. Commander Vasek of the Unyielding and Commander Holt of the Perseverance had read the same tactical situation she had. They were, all 3 of them, the same kind of person. Yara opened a broadcast channel on every frequency the Kreth vessels were using, and several they probably weren't expecting. "This is Commander Yara Ose of the Earth Defense Command Vessel Resolute," she said. Her voice was calm. Not performed calm, actual calm, the kind that comes from having made a decision and being at peace with it. "We received a distress transmission from the Velhari people. We are here in response to that transmission. Identify yourselves and stand down from offensive operations." Silence for 11 seconds, then a response, a voice that the translation AI rendered in flat, affectless English, which somehow made it worse. "Leave, mammals, this conquest is not your concern." Behind Yara, no one on the bridge moved. Lieutenant Kim was watching her screens. Chief Engineer Patel had both hands on his console. The helmsman, a young man named Torres who had grown up in Mexico City and learned to fly in the storms off the Gulf Coast, was absolutely still. "We received a distress call," Yara said. "That makes it our concern." Another silence, longer this time. She imagined the Kreth commander looking at their sensor readings, trying to categorize these 3 unfamiliar ships, running them against their intelligence databases, finding the file. The mammals of the Deathworld, finding the notation, "Do not engage." "Then you do not understand what you are approaching." "I understand exactly what I'm approaching," Yara said. "I'm approaching 11 ships that have been bombing a civilian population. I'm asking you to stop. I'm only going to ask once." The Kreth commander said something that the translation AI flagged as untranslatable, not because the words were unknown, but because the concept was one that humans apparently didn't have a direct equivalent for. The closest approximation the AI offered was a phrase meaning something like contemptuous dismissal from a superior being to an inferior one who doesn't yet know its place. Yara noted this in her log. Then she said, "Weapons hot," to her crew, and to the Kreth, "Last chance." The silence this time lasted 4 seconds. Then the Kreth fleet opened fire. The first thing the Kreth learned was that human ships did not fly like anything they had encountered before. Their targeting systems were calibrated against every spacefaring species in their conquest database, 47 civilizations, ranging from the meekly surrendered to the desperately resistant, and every one of them had fought in ways that made certain assumptions about how much physical stress a crew could absorb. The Kreth fired their opening salvo with precision and confidence and watched, for a single bewildering second, as all three human vessels executed maneuvers that should have been physiologically impossible for any crewed ship. The Resolute rolled 180 degrees on its axis and accelerated directly toward the incoming fire, using the angle change to let the energy weapons pass along its reinforced underside rather than striking the command sections. The Unyielding went perpendicular to the engagement plane at 14G acceleration, a move that would have rendered any Kreth crew unconscious in seconds. The Perseverance simply did not move, absorbing the first hit on its forward armor while simultaneously launching a spread of kinetic impactors at a velocity, and mass the Kreth targeting computers had not been parameterized to intercept. The kinetic impactors hit a Kreth destroyer amidships. The Kreth had not used kinetic weapons in 400 years. They had moved, as most technologically advanced species did, toward energy-based and exotic matter weapon systems. Kinetic weapons were considered primitive. They were also, as the crew of that destroyer learned in the last seconds of their lives, extraordinarily effective against armor systems designed to disperse energy rather than absorb physical impact. The destroyer came apart. On the Resolute's bridge, Torres was flying on pure instinct, the way he had learned to fly through Gulf Coast storm cells, constantly moving, never predictable, treating every moment of stability as a trap. Dara Kim was calling targets with the flat efficiency of someone doing mathematics. Yara was watching everything, tracking the whole board, looking for the pattern the Kreth would fall into because every commander fell into a pattern eventually. She found it in the first 4 minutes. The Kreth fleet was consolidating, pulling their spread formation into a concentrated firing line, the textbook response to an unexpectedly aggressive, smaller force. It was the right move against most opponents. Against humans, it meant they were grouping together. "Perseverance, Vector 7, Yara said into the command channel. "You know what to do." Commander Holt's reply was 3 words, "Already on it." The Perseverance had been built heavier than the other 2 vessels, with a reinforced prow that Earth's engineers had added based on a principle as old as naval warfare. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the ship itself. Holt brought it to ramming speed on a trajectory the Kreth firing line hadn't accounted for because no one in the history of Kreth conquest had ever tried to ram them. The Perseverance didn't ram them. It came close enough that the Kreth formation scattered to avoid it, breaking their firing line, and in the 60 seconds of chaos that followed, the Resolute and Unyielding took out 2 more destroyers and crippled a cruiser. Meanwhile, the Marine teams had been busy. 48 soldiers in vacuum-rated combat armor had deployed from the Unyielding in individual insertion pods, each one the size of a coffin, nearly invisible to sensors, burning toward the Kreth vessels on pure cold gas thrusters. They hit 3 separate Kreth ships within 90 seconds of each other, cutting through hull plating with thermal lances, and then they were inside. The Kreth had not experienced boarding actions in over 2 centuries. They had not needed to. Their conquest model was aerial bombardment followed by ground pacification of whatever remained. Ship-to-ship fighting at close quarters was ancient history. Sergeant Mia Okonkwo led the team on the Kreth cruiser. She was 34 years old from Lagos and had spent 8 years in environments that would have killed most living beings: deep ocean rescue, Antarctic search and rescue, the first Mars colony's emergency response unit. She and her team moved through the Kreth ship like they had been there before, using the ship schematics that the Resolute's sensors had mapped during the opening minutes of the battle. The Kreth soldiers inside were larger than humans. Stronger, probably. What they were not was adapted for this, for close quarters fighting in tight corridors with beings who were neither deterred by their size, nor slowed by low-light conditions, nor confused by the chaos of a ship taking hits. 17 minutes after the battle began, the cruiser's weapons went offline. 31 minutes after the battle began, the remaining Kreth fleet, 6 ships, 2 of them damaged, turned and ran. Yara watched them go. "Do we pursue?" Torres asked. "No," she said. "We didn't come here to chase them. We came here for the Velhari." She looked at the burning planet below them. Somewhere down there, people had sent a signal into the dark and hoped someone would answer. Someone had. The first thing Thesson noticed about the humans was that they were loud. Not rude, she would understand later that volume was simply the frequency at which they operated, a side effect of evolving in an environment where communication had to carry over wind and distance and the noise of other large animals. But in the silence of the Velhari underground shelter, where 4,000 survivors had been hiding for 11 days beneath 3 meters of bedrock, the arrival of Commander Osai's team was an event. Boots on metal, equipment clinking, voices checking in over radio, the sound of people who had never learned to be small. Thesson was the settlement's archivist. She was also, as of 11 days ago, the closest thing the shelter had to a leader, because the actual leaders had been in the government complex when it was hit. She was 31 years old in Velhari terms, roughly equivalent to a human age of 22, and she had spent her entire career cataloging the history of her people. She had never expected to live through the part of that history that would require the most documentation. She was the first one to approach the humans when they came through the tunnel entrance. She came up to Commander Osai's collarbone. Velhari were slender, pale-skinned, with large eyes adapted for the dim light of their cloud-covered world. Their hands had 7 fingers. They breathed through gill-like structures along their necks that fluttered visibly when they were stressed. Every gill in the shelter was fluttering. Osai crouched down, not to be condescending, Thesson realized, but to make herself smaller, to bring herself to eye level. It was a gesture of deliberate gentleness that Thesson found, despite everything, deeply moving. "We got your signal," Osai said through the translation speaker her team carried. The AI had been building a Velhari language model for 6 weeks. It was imperfect. It was enough. Thesson said in Velhari, "We did not believe anyone would come." "Someone always comes," Osai said. And then, because she was human and could not help it, she added, "Sorry it took us so long. We had to argue about it first." Thesson didn't understand the second part. She wrote it down anyway. What followed was 2 weeks that Thesson would spend the rest of her life trying to accurately document. The humans were unlike anything the Velhari had theorized about alien life. They were contradictions made flesh. They moved through the ruined surface of Velhari Prime in full combat gear, weapons ready, scanning every horizon, and then knelt down in the rubble to carefully extract a trapped child, spending 40 minutes on a rescue that carried no tactical value whatsoever. They ate food that Thesson's people found inedible and probably mildly toxic, and suffered no apparent consequences. Their medics worked on Velhari injured with focused urgency and a level of physical confidence that bordered on aggression, stitching, setting, injecting, doing things to damaged bodies that Velhari medicine would have considered brutal, and that demonstrably, repeatedly worked. They made jokes constantly. Thesson could not always understand the jokes. She recorded them all. Sergeant Okonkwo, who led the ground security teams, took it upon herself to learn 10 words of Velhari per day. By the end of the second week, she could hold basic conversations and had earned a nickname from the shelter children that translated approximately as the tall, funny one. She seemed to consider this a significant professional achievement. Thesson followed Commander Osai everywhere she was permitted to go, notebook always open. On the 9th day, sitting in the ruins of what had been the settlement's community hall while her team worked on water reclamation systems, Osai noticed Thesson watching her and asked what she was writing. "Everything," Thesson said. "We will want to remember this accurately." "What do you want to remember most?" Thesson thought about it. "Why you came," she said. "No one in our history has ever done this, gone somewhere they did not have to go for people they did not know at cost to themselves. Our philosophers have theories about why intelligent species behave in self-interested ways. Your being here contradicts the theories. I want to understand it." Osai was quiet for a moment. Around them, the sounds of work, generators humming, voices calling measurements, the beep of scanning equipment. "I'm not sure I can explain it philosophically," she said finally. "We heard that someone needed help. We came." She paused. "I think for us that's the whole sentence. There isn't more to it than that." Thesson wrote it down, word for word. She would have it translated into 47 languages within a year. The news traveled faster than any human ship could follow. The galactic communication networks, older than most spacefaring civilizations, maintained collectively by species who had long ago agreed that information was a shared resource, lit up in ways that the species who ran them had never seen before. The Battle of Velhari Prime was not the largest military engagement in recent galactic history. It wasn't even the most one-sided. The Kreth had fought bigger battles and won more completely. But it was the first battle in living memory that the Kreth had lost. And more than that, it was the first time in anyone's recorded history that a species with no prior relationship to the victims, no territorial interest in the conflict, and no strategic benefit to gain had crossed 340 light-years to answer a distress call from strangers. That detail, more than the military outcome, was what moved through the networks like a shockwave. On a small, cold planet in the outer arm of the galaxy, a species called the Emhenori gray-skinned aquatics who had been paying tribute to the Kreth Dominion for 60 years, too frightened to resist, too isolated to hope, received the news through their planetary communication net. Their council sat in silence for a long time. Then their oldest member, an individual who had been alive when the Kreth first arrived, asked a question that no one on their world had asked in 6 decades. If we sent a signal, would they come? On a gas giant's moon 3 sectors away, the Prel, a cephalopod-descended species who had twice attempted to resist Kreth annexation and twice failed, had an emergency legislative session that lasted 19 hours. At the end of it, they voted to do something they had never done before, transmit a detailed account of their occupation to the new coordinates that were, by now, spreading through every network in the galaxy. The coordinates for Earth. They were not the only ones. In the 6 weeks following Velhari Prime, Earth Defense Command received 31 transmissions from 24 different species. Some were requests for help. Some were just information, maps of Kreth operations, locations of occupied worlds, species who had gone silent and whose last known coordinates were provided in case someone wanted to check on them. Some were simply introductions. Tentative, careful, wondering messages from civilizations that had been watching the blue Deathworld for years and had decided, based on available evidence, that the monsters might be worth knowing after all. At Earth Defense Command, a signals analyst named Private First Class Yusuf Ademi was assigned to log the incoming transmissions. He had been doing the job for 3 weeks when he came to understand that he was logging the end of human isolation. He started keeping a personal count on a notepad. When he reached 30, he stopped counting because the number felt too large to be real. The Kreth Dominion's response was swift, and to anyone who understood the Kreth, deeply revealing. Their high command convened an emergency session and requested their intelligence division produce a threat assessment on humanity. The document that came back was unlike any threat assessment in Kreth history. It was not about weapons capability, although that section was concerning enough. It was not about military doctrine, although that section used the phrase, tactically aberrant, 7 times. It was about motivation. The analyst who wrote it had done her job well. She had tracked the signal from Magdalena Ridge to the council vote to the fleet departure to the battle to the reconstruction efforts underway on Velhari Prime. She had correlated this against everything the Kreth knew about human history. The wars, yes, but also the hospitals they built in disaster zones, and the species they had already saved from extinction on their own planet, and the extraordinary, baffling consistency with which they showed up when something was suffering. Her conclusion was 4 sentences. The human species responds to suffering as an automatic reflex, regardless of self-interest. This response has been observed across their recorded history without exception. They cannot be deterred by demonstrating that the cost of intervention is high, because they appear to calculate cost differently than other species. A civilization that will bleed for strangers is a civilization with no exploitable threshold. The High Command read this in silence. Then the commander of the Dominion's Eastern forces asked the question that had no good answer. How do you make peace with something that doesn't need a reason to fight you? 3 of their client states defected that week. The Interspecies Assembly met for the first time on neutral ground, a space station that had been built in haste, in 6 weeks, by 7 different species who had never constructed anything together before. It was ugly. The corridors didn't quite align. The gravity plating ran at 3 different settings in adjacent sections because no one had agreed on a standard. The air recyclers were working at about 70% efficiency, which meant the whole station smelled faintly of whatever the Emhenori breathed. 3 separate species had installed their own lighting systems and hadn't coordinated, resulting in certain hallways being simultaneously too dark and too bright depending on which wavelengths your eyes used. Yara Osa walked through it and thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. 31 civilizations, gathered in a place that hadn't existed 2 months ago for a meeting that had never happened in galactic history. Some of them were meeting each other for the first time, and their reactions ranged from wonder to terror to the careful diplomatic neutrality of species who had learned the hard way to be cautious about new things. Several of them had never been in the same room, the same station, as humans before, and Yara noticed the way they tracked her team's movements with the particular alertness of creatures near something large and unpredictable. She did not take offense. She understood it now. She had read File 7. She had also, over the past 2 months, read everything that had come in with the 31 transmissions. The stories were not abstract. They had names and timelines and specific losses, species reduced to fragments of their former populations, cultures that existed now only in the memories of survivors, worlds that had been stripped of their resources and left to recover alone. 60 years of Kreth conquest, documented in the voices of the people who had lived through it. She stood at the front of the assembly chamber. It had been built in a shape that no single species would find perfectly ergonomic, which she had been told was intentional. A physical reminder that this was a shared space, not anyone's home territory. Representatives of 31 civilizations looked at her from seats, platforms, immersion tanks, and in 2 cases pure gas environments viewed through sealed transparent panels. She had prepared a speech. She had written it and rewritten it a dozen times on the journey over, something about unity, about shared values, about the future. She set it aside. "I'm going to keep this simple," she said, and waited for the translators to catch up. "Because simple is what works." She looked at the room. At Thesson, who was in the front row with her notebook, who had come all this way to document this moment because someone had to, and she had decided it would be her. At General Diallo, who had voted yes in Geneva and whose vote had started all of this. At the Mhenori representative, who was small and gray and had traveled 40 light years to be in this room. "Every species in this room has been alone," Yara said. "Some of you have been alone while terrible things were done to you. That happened because the galaxy had decided, somewhere along the way, that what happened to someone else wasn't your problem. That suffering had a boundary where your self-interest ended." She paused. "Humans have never believed that. I can't explain why. It's not a philosophy we arrived at, it's a reflex. We hear someone calling for help and we go. It has cost us throughout our history enormously. It has also made us, I think, what we are." She looked down at the podium, then back up. "What I'm asking this assembly to ratify today is not a treaty or an alliance in the traditional sense. It's simpler than that. It is a single commitment made by every member without exception or conditions." She read it from the card she'd written it on, because she had wanted to get the words right. "Any species that transmits a distress call in good faith will receive a response. We will come. The distance does not matter. The cost does not matter. If you call, we will come." The chamber was quiet. Then the Mhenori representative, the old one, the one who had asked if we sent a signal, would they come, rose from his seat. He didn't speak. He simply stood up. One by one, across the chamber, others stood. It took 4 minutes. At the end of 4 minutes, every representative was standing. Even the ones in the gas environment panels had triggered the rising indicator lights they'd been given for the purpose. Even Dr. Horn, who was there as the economic advisor, and had spent the last 2 months building the financial framework for how you sustain an interstellar mutual aid organization, was standing, and he looked faintly surprised at himself. The Deathworlders' doctrine was ratified unanimously. The Kreth Dominion received a formal copy within the hour. Their response, logged and filed in the new Assembly's records, was silence. 3 more client states defected by the end of the week. Yara left the chamber and found Thesson waiting in the corridor, notebook open. "You're going to write about this," Yara said. It wasn't a question. "I already am," Thesson said. She showed Yara the page. The last line she'd written, the one she'd set down during the standing ovation, was this: "They are dangerous the way a storm is dangerous, not because they wish to destroy, but because they were built for it, and they have decided to aim that at the ones who deserve it." Yara read it twice. "Is that accurate?" Thesson asked. Yara thought about New Mexico, about a vote in Geneva, about Torres flying through weapons fire like he was navigating a hurricane, about Sergeant Okonkwo learning 10 words of Velhari per day. About 31 transmissions from civilizations that had given up hope. "Yeah," she said, "I think that's pretty accurate." Above them, through the misaligned hull plating and the imperfect gravity and the overworked air recyclers of a station built in 6 weeks by species who had never met before, the stars burned cold and very, very far away. Somewhere out there, someone was already composing the next distress call. Somewhere on Earth, someone would answer it. And